this year's series of Conversations on Glass by Apice, taking place as part of the Italian Glass Weeks, which is an international festival dedicated to glass in all its forms. The first week took place in Milan from the 10th to the 18th of September, and in Venice from the 17th to the 25th of September, so we're in full swing as we speak. I'm Camilla Purden, and I work as the coordinator of the Venice week of the festival. And this year, we are presenting a series of daily online panel discussions, Conversations on Glass by Apice, which is a leading transportation company for works of art with special expertise in the transportation of glass works. These conversations are designed to cover a range of topics relating to the field of glass, involving speakers from Italy and abroad, with the aim of providing a platform for reflections and discussions on all aspects of the world of glass. And I'm personally especially looking forward to today's conversation, which will introduce and explore the major exhibition titled Sargent, Whistler and Venetian Glass, American Artists and the Magic of Murano. Such a brilliant title. The exhibition was originally organized by and took place at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, but it is currently on tour and opening very soon on the 15th of October of 2022 at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut in the States, the largest maritime museum in America. And so today, in advance of the opening, we are really delighted to be joined by two special guests who are going to be telling us more about the show and some of the themes and the topics it addresses. First of all, we have with us Crawford Alexander Mann III, Director of Curatorial Affairs and the Chief Curator at the Telfair Museums in Savannah, USA. And we have Christina Conant-Brophy, Senior Vice President of Curatorial Affairs and Senior Director of the Museum Galleries at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut, which is where the exhibition is opening soon. Alex Mann joined Telfair Museums in 2021 as Director of Curatorial Affairs and Chief Curator, with responsibility for overseeing all of the organization's programmatic activities and for curating its collection of pre-1945 American and European fine art. He was previously curator of prints and drawings at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, DC, where he created this exhibition and catalogue for Sargent, Whistler and Venetian Glass, American Artists and the Magic of Murano. He's received research fellowships from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Corning Museum of Glass, amongst many others. And he studies American art within international dialogues and exchanges from neoclassical sculpture and the Grand Tour to 20th century African American and Asian American art. And we are really delighted to have him with us here today. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We actually had the pleasure of seeing each other here in Venice a couple of weeks ago. I know you're now joining us from Berlin, and you will very shortly be heading to Mystic. So it's so nice to have you with us online. We also have Christina Conant-Brophy, who is Senior Vice President of Museum Galleries at Mystic Seaport Museum. She is the former Douglas and Cynthia Crocker Endowed Chair for the Chief Curator at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, where she's curated over 30 exhibitions and authored and edited all related publications on maritime and other subjects, ranging from fine art and climate change to whale conservation. She's partnered with the US Navy, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Consulate General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, amongst others, and has lectured extensively in Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and the USA on cartography, visual arts, maritime history, and other topics. And so we're extremely grateful to you, Christina, for joining us here today online to tell us about this wonderful new exhibition that's opening so soon with you in Mystic. But before I pass over to you both, I'd just like to quickly introduce a representative of our sponsor, Apice, Melania Granzo, exhibition manager, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of our sponsor. So Apice, Melania, I know you're muted at the moment, but if you turn your microphone on just to say a few words.
Here I am. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you all to be here to participate in this conversation on glass. We are very happy. I mean, Apice is extremely happy to be here even this year to support these conversations, and even this year to be the fine art transport agents of the exhibition Le Stanze del Vetro. As you well said, this is an important meeting we have all the years, and glass is the material we know the best, being in Venice and the Murano furnaces nearby. So we really think that work with this exhibition, with this material, helps us to have even different opinions on how to handle this particular material and fragile material, and how to pack it. I mean that the different meetings with lenders, artists, curators helps us to better understand the material and to do our best to make everybody happy of what we do. And Apice thinks that even these conversation on glasses are really important to achieve even more knowledge of the materials. So thank you all for attending and to be here to speak of this important object, glass material, which focus the attention even of Murano, which is so important these days. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you.
Wonderful, Melania. Well, thank you so much. And so I think now we can hand over to Alex and Christina. I know Christina's kindly going to kick off with a brief introduction to the context, and then we have some wonderful slides which will tantalizingly give a sense of the exhibition to come. And I know all of us who aren't currently looking forward to a visit to Mystic will be very envious by the end of this talk, but I'm sure it'll certainly sway quite a few decisions to come and see the show when it opens in October. So over to you.
Great. Next slide, please. Welcome everybody. I'm so thrilled to be asked to participate in your program. It's so fun to see Alex again, who's one of the most charming and kind people ever, and has been so helpful getting this exhibition organized with us at Mystic Seaport Museum. So this is opening in October 15th, will run through February in our largest exhibition gallery. I'm going to show you a little bit more about the museum, but it's on loan to us, of course, from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We are the third venue of this exhibition. It was meant to go to Venice and it was canceled because of COVID. And so the director of the Smithsonian, Stephanie Stevich, gave me a call and asked if we might be interested. We totally jumped on the opportunity. I came down to DC and saw the show. We were blown away by it. Alex did a beautiful job. There's a fabulous catalog that we'll touch on a little bit more later in the program. But this exhibition, as with any heavily loaned show, provides this unique opportunity to see a lot of pieces together that you would never get the opportunity otherwise. Next slide. So just a quick bit about us, and then I'm going to pass it over to Alex to go over the themes of the show. We are America's leading maritime museum, and we host about 200 to 250 visitors, 1,000 visitors a year. And we have really robust educational programs. We're located in the beautiful village of Mystic, Connecticut, which is on the Mystic River. So we're very unique that we're actually on a waterfront. We are also impacted quite a lot with sea level rise and flooding. So and we have quite a lot of historic buildings. We actually have 133 buildings in total, and many of those are historic and are have jeopardized by sea level rise. So we have a lot to talk about that with Venice as well. And we're actually working in partnership with Save Venice on some of this program, which is exciting for us because that's something that's deep in our challenges today. Mystic is actually a homeland of the Mashantucket Pequot tribes. And they're also involved in this exhibition, which I'll get to later on. Mystic's best known for shipbuilding, and our site actually is the site of an historic shipyard. We now have another one that was built in the 60s. And it's also been very prominent in fishing and whaling, but then became a textile city. My office is actually in a beautiful, ginormous textile mill right across the street that used to specialize in velvet. And what you see here is our Charles W. Morgan. It's the oldest American commercial ship that exists in the world today. It was built in 1841, and it's one of our iconic historic vessels. Next slide. This is an aerial map of the campus, just to give you an idea of the scale. There's a little reference on the right side, north entrance, and that's actually where the gallery is located for this show. But we also have a 19th century reproduction village. The buildings are historic, but the village itself is constructed fictionally. We have a working shipyard, we have a marina, we have a planetarium, but it's about 20 acres of land that's available for visitors to see. Next slide. This is our working shipyard about to launch the Mayflower 2s, just to give you again the idea of scale and our proximity to Mystic Village. Tourism is now our biggest industry, and it's one of the reasons that we are putting on shows like this to draw people from near and far. Next slide. And quickly, other collections include the Rosenfelds. We have a huge photograph collection. We have about 1,500 works of scrimshaw. So, and there's some additional pictures if you keep clicking. That's the oldest vessel in the program. We have 500 waterfront. Oh, sorry, that's a little too much. We have 500 vessels. We also have 68 figureheads, 1,300 paintings, over 2,000 ship models, and tons of logbooks and journals and prints in our research library. Next slide. And this is, that last one is actually contemporary work by Alexis Rockman that'll show in the same gallery as Alex's program next spring. This is the exhibition hall where the Sargent Whistler show will be housed. So you can see it's right on the waterfront in a very modern building. This was built in 2016 and allows us to do projects like this. State of the art, completely oblivious to sea level rise. It's sort of built to withstand an incredible amount of activity from storms and sea level rise. And then if you look on the left of that flag, there's actually going to be a new hotel and restaurant that will be built in 2024. So if you come that year, please come and stay with us. So that's going to be quite exciting. And just last for this section, this was the first exhibition, the Turner show that was on loan from the Tate that came, that one. That was our first major art show in the Collins Gallery within the Thompson building. So this is part of that trajectory to do a show like Sargent, Whistler, and Venetian glass to celebrate our 5,000 square foot exhibition hall that again is state of the art and able to handle significant fine art exhibitions. So I'm going to turn this over now to Alex to talk about what you really want to hear, and I will be back later.
Christina, thank you so much. Next slide. And Camilla, thank you also for featuring this show as a part of Venetian Glass Week and Italian Glass Week. It's been so much fun for me to put this together, to take my expertise and background in American paintings and watercolors and fine prints and connect them to a different world, but a world that is, as you'll see through this conversation, in fact, very interrelated. And that was our goal within the exhibition. So I'm going to take you through some of the main themes that you'll find and show you some of the most important objects and also just a few of my personal favorites from within the show, some of the pieces I fell in love with. Next slide. Through the course of putting this together, the show came together over the course of almost 8 years, and then that involved some enormous help from institutions like the Corning Museum of Glass and numerous scholars in Venice to facilitate the research. Next slide. But everything really started with the image looking at right here. And this is a print by James Whistler, a dry point called Murano Glass Furnace. Next slide. And Whistler was in Venice. There's a typo on the screen. It says 1870 to 80. It's 1879 to 80, a really short time that he was over there, just about 14 months. But during this one visit that Whistler made to Venice, it was a turning point within his career where he produced several paintings, dozens of watercolors and beautiful pastels, and about 40 some prints. And we're using some of these within the exhibition because they show us what he was doing in Venice, what he was looking at, what he was fascinated by in particular. And let's look more closely, next slide, at this particular print. This is one that he did not publish after his travels in Venice. It was only produced in about 7 impressions, so we're very lucky to have one for the exhibition. But I'm going to show you some of the details so you can kind of see what's going on here. Those of you who have spent time in glass furnaces and on Murano, next slide, we'll zoom in and you might be able to recognize a little bit of what is happening in this picture. So that is your furnace in the center of the image, and there just to the right of it, you've got a couple of workers standing and it looks like they are thrusting their pontes into the furnace, probably working on some pieces right there. Next slide. Probably the clearest image within this print that you can see is this seated man here. Next slide. We'll blow it up for you just a little bit, and you can see that this is the glass worker. He's seated at his bench, and he is turning. He's actually working a piece of blown glass there. Just a bit of a kind of a hazy, sketchy, almost sort of action-packed way in which Whistler is presenting this scene of multiple glass workers in the studio, in the furnace, all at once. Next slide. And then if we look over to the left of the image, we see a group of people here. This is a group of spectators, of tourists who are in the furnace on Murano in 1880, actually watching glassmaking in action. Next slide. And I think if we compare, Whistler has actually included a self-portrait. So he has shown you that he, as an artist, has, while he's in Venice, put down his paintbrush and his etching needle in order to go and watch the amazing glass blowers of Murano do their art. And then in honor and tribute to that, has made that the subject for one of his own works. So the first time I saw this print and this image by Whistler of other artists at work, it set my mind thinking about the connections between these two different types of art making, between the fine art glass blowing that was happening on Murano and all of the production that was happening by Americans who were visiting Venice in this time period. Next slide. Now, what I think is really special about Whistler's image is, in fact, the way that some of these details that we've just been zooming in on are a little bit hard to see. And this is what critics said about this print when it was first exhibited. One person wrote, "It skillfully avoids any infringement of the commandment against making images of any objects known to man." Next slide. Vaguely, one discerns some oblong things and some bristly things of unfamiliar character. And of course, I think this is very typical of the responses of the public to Whistler's work at this time. Some criticized it as being murky, as being difficult to see, but others loved his works precisely for their atmospheric quality. In his paintings, their sense of color. And I think in some ways what Whistler is really capturing for us here is perhaps the actual difficulty that he would have experienced as a tourist in the glass furnaces of Murano, where the light was bad and there was smoke and dark and movement. And for a person to be in that space as a tourist and actually to know what the glassmakers are doing was probably a little bit difficult back in those days. And I think Whistler has given us that sense of the darkness and probably also of the enormous, intense heat of the furnaces within the lines and the patterns of this print. Next slide. Here for a little bit more clear image of glassworking in Venice, we can compare this to a very clean scene. This is from a sort of advertisement admission ticket that a tourist in the 1880s or 90s to Venice might have received, inviting them to go and visit Antonio Salviati's studios over on Murano and watch glass blowing in action. And we can see it's actually the same scene as you're finding in Whistler's print. Next slide. So if you zoom in, there is the guy right there, the glass worker sitting at his bench. And next slide, looking more closely at him, we can see one of the fantastic pieces, a classic example of late 19th century Venetian glass revival, fine art, blown glass with wonderful sculptural figures. And next slide. Compare this to an actual object, which is in our show, this vase with a dolphin and serpent. And you can see how the serpent form is being crafted, hot worked into the handle of this vase so that it becomes an object which is more of a work of art, a piece of sculpture, not something with all of its fine details that you would actually want to handle or use, but something that through all of its colors and beautiful shapes and textured surface would be something for one to acquire as a work of fine art to be put on one's mantle or in the centerpiece of one's table and to be admired. So not functional glass, but glass that was making a case for itself as aspiring to the level of sophistication, both in form and in technical difficulty of painting and other art making of that era. And I think that's something that Whistler and many American travelers and also collectors of his era understood, this relationship between these two types of art making and this breaking down of genres, of differences in hierarchy between glassmaking and painting and other traditional forms of fine art, and to put all these together in their own collecting practices and in their homes, and eventually in museums. So that's what we did in the show. Next slide. By gathering together some fantastic examples to really share with our audience the range of shapes and colors and techniques that Venetian glassmakers of the late 19th century were doing, were marketing, and were selling to American consumers, what visitors to the glass furnaces of Murano, like Whistler, would have seen and admired. Next slide. So you all are probably very familiar with Venetian history, and particularly with the history of the glassmaking industry. And so you're aware that Venetian glassmaking reached enormous peaks of success and virtuosity during the Renaissance and 17th centuries, and then went through something of a decline, particularly in the early 19th century, until it was revived with great success in the 1860s by Dr. Antonio Salviati and his company through the reintroduction of a high-level production of artistic blown glassware of the type you're seeing here, and then exhibiting this on an international market. Next slide. Some of the pieces that Salviati was producing were replicas or interpretations of historical examples. So, for example, his glassmakers were looking at things like this page, which is from a catalog from the British Museum of their collection of earlier glass, that is glass from the Renaissance and Baroque era, and then copying, repeating these forms, 19th century glassmakers looking at older examples and learning all of those techniques and designs. Next slide. One of my favorite objects in the show is this ewer, this sauce boat that is actually in the shape of a boat, because I think through its construction and the wonderful rigging that you're seeing here, this was really putting the glassmakers to the test to look at the Renaissance examples. And this one in particular is fun. This is a piece that was originally patented in the 1500s by a female glassmaker named Arminia Vivarini, and then of course revived, and we have many examples of 19th century versions, replicas of this that were produced, and this one is from the collection of the City Museum of New York, and probably made in the 1870s. Next slide. One of the greatest achievements of the 19th century Venetian glassmakers was to produce a replica of another earlier vessel, and that is the Guggenheim Cup. And we're very lucky to have an example of this within the exhibition. If you have not seen this piece in person, you need to either come to the show at Mystic, or next slide, go over to the Museo del Vetro, where they also have an example of this. It is 26 inches tall. The stem of this giant lidded vase is a sort of three-tier scaffolding. It is really just an incredible virtuoso piece of glassmaking that shows off the skill and the tradition and just the readiness that Venetian glassmakers of the late 19th century had for extreme challenges to their prowess in manipulating the material. Next slide. In addition to replicating historical forms, the glassmakers were also experimenting and combining different elements, finding new colors and patterns, and adding on to the historical vocabulary of possibilities with glassmaking. And so an easy example of this is this beautiful chalice with an initial S in the center of it. And you could find pieces of Venetian glass with almost every letter of the alphabet in it. You had really an infinite amount of choices here. Next slide. We'll zoom in and just show you some of the details and really fine workmanship of this with these two symmetrical swans and a little wreath, and then wonderful bow adorning the front of the stem of this particular chalice. Next slide. And then the beautiful finicio, the sort of combed pattern that we get in the colors on the bowl at the top, with some Venetian aventurine gold flecked glass mixed as one of the colors here. It doesn't show up well on my slide, and that's just another one of the reasons why you need to experience Venetian glass firsthand, and why it's so easy to understand the fascination that this held for tourists and for consumers during the late 19th century. Next slide. And maybe my favorite piece of glass in the entire exhibition is this completely whimsical, novel, very rare form where the vase is entirely in the shape of a fish. And he is sort of perched on this eel that is rising up out of the water. Next slide. With really beautiful patterns and colors and sort of striations used in the body of the fish. I would challenge any glassmaker today to try to do something like this. I'm sure there are some that could pull it off, but it would be really beautiful to see it happen. And I think it is just a sort of showing not just of the talent of the Venetian glassmakers of the late 19th century, but their level of just pure experimentation and having fun with the medium and seeing what was possible. And I think that sense of experimentation and of openness to new ideas and new directions is something that other artists who were visiting Venice, such as Whistler, Sargent, and other Americans of this time period, were seeing and responding to an atmosphere of overall creativity that was really exemplified in the glass industry and continuing out into other branches of art making. Next slide. Here, a quick look at the base of the statue, and you can see that it's sort of a wave and a kind of crest with little shells that have all been formed. Every detail of this very carefully thought through. Next slide. So here is an image from a publication from the late 19th century that just shows you this enormous variety. And I promise you that the displays at the exhibition will not be quite this overwhelming. And hopefully they'll be arranged in a way that you can appreciate the details of each piece individually. But I think that this shows you the ambition of the Venetian glassmakers in this time period to exercise their skills and to get this out there on an international market. Next slide. And here's some instances of their success at that. I'm showing you some images from American periodicals from the late 19th century with illustrations of some of the new, what they were calling modern Venetian glass, because these are glass works that were made in the 1870s and 80s and receiving press attention around the world in the United States during that time period. Next. Here from Peterson's Magazine, which was sort of a ladies' home journal of its era, with an article on Venetian glass and some wonderful illustrations. Next. And here another modern Venetian glass. These articles were also explaining the process of glass making, which seemed to be such a mystery to American audiences. There was very limited production of glass in the United States during this time period, and that's another reason that these particular objects were so fascinating to their American audiences, that there were not places in the United States, very, very few, where people could go and watch glass being made, and certainly nothing of the caliber and the beauty of what was coming out of Murano in the 1880s and 90s. Next slide. And you can see these are very accurate illustration images, and we have pieces in the exhibition that bear witness to that. Next slide. In addition to blown glass, there were other facets of the Venetian glass revival that may receive less attention today, but we wanted to include all of them and show the variety of that within the show. And one of those is Venetian glass mosaics. So in the 1860s, at the same time that Antonio Salviati and his company were investing in new production of fine Venetian blown glassware, they were also setting up mosaic workshops for the restoration of the mosaics on the exterior and interior of San Marco and other churches, but also for the production of architectural mosaics for other buildings around Europe and in the United States. And you find other examples of Venetian mosaic work, such as this replica by Luigi Taddei, that is a very large interpretation in small mosaic tiles of one of the lunette panels from the facade of St. Mark's Cathedral. So here you have the Venetians copying their own works in mosaic and then sending these pieces on international tour. So this particular mosaic of St. Mark's body being venerated by the Doge after being made in Venice, completed in 1871, was exhibited in Australia and Scotland, around Europe, and in several places in the United States during the 1880s and 1890s. Next slide. And the largest set of Venetian glass and mosaics outside of Venice is actually to be found in Palo Alto, California, on the campus of Stanford University, where Jane Stanford commissioned Salviati and his company to execute mosaic decorations for the chapel of Stanford University. And we've included a number of elements within the exhibition to reference this very important story, a huge commission for the Venetians, an example of Venetian glassmaking moving around the world from Italy to the San Francisco Bay Area during the first decade of the 20th century. And note that that portrait of Jane Stamford that you're seeing there on the right is done in glass mosaic. So that is not a painting that you're seeing here. And next slide. Finally, you have American artists in Venice, artists like Maurice Prendergast, looking at the style of these mosaics, and I think borrowing from this in his own style of painting, as you're seeing here in Ponte della Paglia, where he's developing a type of pointillism, of divisionism, which functions very much in the same way that an artist would have to use their mind and composition skills in building a mosaic. And we know that Prendergast himself actually did complete one mosaic while he was in Venice. We don't know the backstory behind this, whether he was working with other Venetian glassmakers, but this is a composition you're seeing here on the left called Fiesta Grand Canal, Venice, that he created both a watercolor and a mosaic of this same image. So drawing a one-to-one correlation between the visual character of a mosaic and the way that he could handle paint either on canvas or as an artist working in watercolor. So these really, I think, intense and creative dialogues and exchanges between glassmaking and mosaic making during this time period and what American artists were doing. Next slide. Finally, I want to finish by sharing a little bit about John Singer Sargent, an artist who worked off and on in Venice for many decades of his career, was known to spend much time in the Palazzo Barbaro, where he was an associate of the Curtis family who lived there. And I'm showing you a painting from the show of the interior of the Barbaro, one of the Grand Salon, a room that Sargent would have known very well from his time in Venice. And as you can see in this painting, next slide, everywhere that Sargent went in Venice, he really would have been surrounded by Venetian glass. There's a beautiful glass chandelier right here in this painting. Next slide. But in Sargent's own paintings, his paintings of beautiful Venetian women that he was doing in the 1880s, we find elements of the glass industry as well. So a Venetian woman painted in 1882 is holding in her arm what appears to be a blue fan, but this is in fact, next slide, a bundle of glass rods that are a midpoint in the stage of bead making. Yet another aspect of the Venetian glass industry that was very strong in the late 19th century. And so these are rods that she has sorted and prepared for the next stage in the process, which is then for them to be cut into smaller beads and then polished, strung, and then sold on the international market. And I'm showing you here some Venetian glass bead sample cards that we have displayed in the show, so that when you see someone like Sargent's model here, who is posing as a bead worker, you can also see the actual beads, which Sargent and other visitors to Venice would have been very aware of. They would have been familiar with the activity of the bead making industry, since this was roughly 50% of, in fact, all glass making that was happening on Murano during this time period. Next slide. I want to show you a few more examples of the beads, because I think even though beads were not as respected by American travelers and tourists and collectors as the fine art blown glass of this period, when we look closely at the beads, next slide, we see that they are in fact using many of the same glassmaking techniques that you find in the larger and more complex fine art vetri artistici that Salviati and his workers are making. Next slide. And finally, you see even some beads that were deliberately, specifically, obviously made for an international American market. So a group of beads here, including some that feature images of the American flag. So this complete awareness by the Venetians that their works are being seen, being sold all around the world, including to an American audience. So a great example of this dialogue here. And next slide. Finally, back to Whistler. He is also very aware of the bead making industry in works like this beautiful dry point titled Old Women, again from that 1879 to 1880 visit. You see, next slide, and slide after that, women sitting outside of a shop on the streets of Venice, hunched over. What is this woman doing? She is sorting and stringing beads. Next slide. If we compare this to a period photograph, we can see that Venice was filled in this time period with young women who were participants making money in the bead making industry by taking batches of beads and then taking them home and doing this as piecework, stringing beads and then being paid by volume for the amount of work that they were being done. So this was a ubiquitous activity around the streets of Venice, and bead workers appear as stoppage figures in many of Whistler's street views of Venice from this time period. Next slide. So this pretty much wraps up my little introduction to some of the main themes and some of my favorite objects from the show. And my effort through this to help us all take a journey over from Venice to Murano through the eyes and through the experiences and through the works of art which American visitors would have been seeing in the late 19th century. Next slide. And I want to close by a pair of paintings that to me were a very important part of this exhibition. You're looking at here on the left, a picture called Composition Venetienne by the American painter Julius Leblanc Stewart, who was a society painter who was known for very detailed and beautiful images of rich and beautiful women traveling around Europe during this time period. And comparing that to a work by Herman Dudley Murphy, who's an artist who's working very much in the style of Whistler, someone who is interested in tonalism, impressionism, and play of light and colors. And these are actually two views of exactly the same thing. You are standing on the Fondamenta Nove on the north side of the island of Venice, looking across the lagoon toward the island of Murano. So these are basically two views of Murano by two different artists working in the same place, but in different years at different times of day, and with completely different aesthetic vocabularies, with ideas of what painting should look like. And I think the variety in their work, the variety that we find within the work of all American artists who were traveling and working in Venice in this time period, is akin to the wonderful variety and beauty and magic that we find in the breadth of Venetian glassmaking from the same time period. And we've tried to put all of this together into one big exhibition and to let you explore all this and hopefully find your own favorites within the show. I'm really excited that we were able to put this together and finish it during COVID, despite having a range of loans from, I think, almost 40 different institutions and private collections, and also to produce a beautiful catalog that has a couple of essays from me and 4 other scholars and illustrations of all the works in the show. So I encourage you to look for the catalog on the website of the Mystic Seaport Museum, and it's also available from Amazon if you want to experience some of these and read deeper into some of this history, whether you're able to come and see the exhibition or not. That's out there as a resource for you. So with that, I'll hand this back over to Christina to tell us a little bit more about what we can expect from Mystic's presentation of the exhibition.
Well, thanks, Alex. I love that many of your favorites are also mine. This Herman Dudley Murphy, an artist I'd never heard of before I saw your show. I'm absolutely in love with it. And we've actually put this pretty front and center to the entrance. We've reorganized a little bit to really devote a lot of space to the maritime connections in the beginning of our installation. The Prendergast too, they're just mind-blowing. And the two together, the way juxtaposed, and they're displayed in a very similar fashion in our installation. It's just such an amazing kind of partnership of media that I think is wonderful. So have the first slide of the next section, please. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of changes we've made or additions we've made. We're trying to incorporate more of our collections into the show to continue that relevance for Mystic Seaport Museum specifically. The show is so phenomenally beautiful. We didn't want to make many alterations, but we did want to add a few things that would kind of make our venue have a few more things to see, a slightly different perspective. So if you have seen the show in DC, this will be a slightly different experience. I do not have a picture of the installation walls as they are now because it's a mess in there with, construction and ladders and all kinds of stuff. But I will share this with Camilla if she wants to post them at a later point once we get that all sorted out. As Alex mentioned, we have trucks showing up tomorrow afternoon with the material. So it's going to be full bore to get this all prepared in time for October 15th. These are actually the glass door entrances. We had to increase the opacity of the entranceway for the sake of the objects inside. What we decided to do was to celebrate a brand new collection that just came to us from California, but there are 800 glass plate negatives that were taken by Henry Hiller, who was a whaler, fur trader, diplomat, Tiffany buyer, incredibly interesting person, was married to this incredible Russian woman when he met her in Siberia when he was an American consul there. But we scoured this collection that literally came to us, I think, 2 months ago to see if he'd taken any pictures of Venice, because he had many different pictures of Europe and they're the exact same time period. So we've identified a few, and because they're glass plate next slide, please. And so, of course, we wanted to create also this sort of bridge from Italy to America. I saw the New Glass Now show at the Renwick that Susie Silbert, who you all know, was heavily involved with when I went to go see Alex's installation in DC. And I was really struck by the idea of, and I'm always interested in, why do these things matter now? Like, how does this kind of relationship continue to resonate in our contemporary world? So I called Susie up. She was incredibly generous. We put together a list of about, I'd even 20, 30 amazing artists who all have direct ties to Venetian glass and their inspiration. And, with space and loans and all that, we were able to incorporate some that I'll show you today. I wish we could do a lot more, but we wanted to include some that were really special. So this is a terrible picture of the Lino Tale Pietra that we have coming to the show. It's the smaller one. You can see kind of a quarter of that's shaped like a lozenge, but it's from a local collector who's also a donor to the exhibition. And it's just a lovely piece that speaks a lot to another piece that's coming to the show. But of course, I don't need to introduce Lino Tale Pietra to you guys at all, but being the sort of maestro, the connector of Murano and American glassmaking. Many of the artists you'll see in the next few slides were trained by him, certainly inspired by him, and really hoping that he'll come see the exhibition at some point. But he definitely was one of the key pieces and the only Italian that we're including in this section. Next slide. This is not the selection that we have coming. I don't have a picture of it yet, but another private lender is giving us a piece by Chihuly. It's a seafoam piece that, again, is this great connector of one of the greatest maestros of all time, who trained so many of the artists that are in the exhibition and with whom we are all, I'm sure, very familiar. Next slide. Oh, the text is not appearing. That's interesting. Huh. Okay. Well, that's difficult. So this is Deborah Choresco. This is her hippo foot, which was actually shown in Venice in the Stanza del Vetro in 20 and 21. She is a fascinating artist. This is actually solid cast glass. She had a couple of pieces in the Renwick. She's very known for her chandeliers, which are done in meat, and she's very interested in gender dynamics and hot shops and the androgynous nature of glass itself. But she was playing with the idea of souvenirs made by Venetian glassmakers in these sort of solid cast pieces, and also the sort of fetishism of animals going extinct. But this is one of her pieces that's on loan from the Heller Gallery, to whom I'm also eternally grateful. It's a fairly small piece, sorry, the dimensions are not showing up. But it's a gorgeous piece, and this will be in the case of contemporary works. There's a great video of hers that was done with the Renwick online. All of these artists pretty much that I'm showing you have programs online that are fabulous. And I'm going to be pretty quick, but that whimsical nature that Alex was talking about with that fabulous fish piece, her pieces remind me so much in many ways of that whimsy. And one piece that we couldn't possibly fit in the show, I don't even know where it is, but I love the pictures of it. It's a tequila set in a Venetian style she made with the tequila worm on top instead of a sea creature, which is really kind of fabulous. Next slide. This is Nancy Callum. It's called Orange Crush, and this also is on loan from the Heller Gallery. And she has an amazing process. She's an extraordinary artist. She studied with Lino Tagliapietra. This one actually almost reminds me of a squashed Tagliapietra in the way she sort of makes these, but she creates a cylinder, and then she, plays with all kinds of rods and techniques and patterns, and then she'll allow it to harden, slice it, and then sort of flatten it over a period of time in a kiln, and it becomes this flat glass piece. And I liked that there was this kind of play between the two-dimensional works and the paintings and also the glass. So this is in the show too. Next slide. This is a local artist named Jeffrey Pan, who also studied with Lino Tagliapietra. He's right down the street, and we'll be doing programming during our exhibition of blowing techniques with various people, but it'll be in person at a studio, which is about a half a mile from campus. He's also an expert in Venetian styles since this period of Venetian glass revival and kind of how it progressed, really starting with Lino Tagliapietra and others. And you can see here, there's some cutouts, and he's using a lot of Lino's vocabulary, but he's sort of created his own take on those really beautiful techniques and strategies. Next slide. This is Norwood Vidiano. This is one of his simulated pieces. This has never been touched by human hands during its production. It's made out of this UV and laser setting resin, and it uses a lot of the techniques that are used in car manufacturing to create quick and dirty prototypes. But what he does here is it's a criticism really of and a celebration of historical objects that we idealize, and also their history and time. But these are made out of this resin that's very thin, it's very beautiful, it's totally functional, but it's made in an incredibly different way than the Venetian glass goblets that are also in the show. But I think this is a very elegant modern take on that Venetian glass trajectory. Next slide. And this is Kim Hardy. This is a really beautiful piece. It's actually, you can tell it's a photograph. This is going to be also hanging on the wall next to Nancy Callum, but it's from a book published in the 1960s of old Venetian glass from the Wojtek Lana collection that's now in the Prague Museum of Industrial Art. But in that book, there were 72 photographic images of 16th to 18th century Venetian glass. And she's reproduced each of those plates with a slow exposure photograph, performing a silhouette of each piece. So I find this one particularly fun because it's incorporating so many different things in the same piece. Next slide. And then with the glass beads, this is one of the things we became really fascinated with when I read the label, and there's a small sort of nod to the fact that these were used in dispossession of Native peoples. And as I mentioned, we're on Mashantucket Pequot land, and we're doing a lot of work partnering with local tribal nations actually throughout New England, and a major project that's opening in 24. So on Indigenous and Black American maritime experiences in New England. So this was a really interesting way for us to have conversations with the Tamaqua Museum to talk about what this dispossession and the integrated use of glass in Indigenous work over time meant. Next slide. So this is a top hat, which I find it's an absolutely beautiful object. It's kind of hard to imagine. It has so many facets to it. I didn't want to include too many pictures, but it incorporates glass, and blue glass beads have a whole nother history with African slave trade and identity and fascinating story. But here they're including wampum, which is made from local quahog shells. There's bone. There are bone beads that are more traditional indigenous material, and also a lot of glass. Glass was not produced by Native Americans. It was obviously introduced really through the trade of Venetian glass beads, early days of contact. Next slide. And then this, I think, is really fun because it speaks to a lot of Alex's details. But this is a piece by Dan Loudfoot Simmons, who's Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nations member. And he uses 200 to 400-year-old Venice beads in his piece. So these are actually historic. These are not 19th century revivalist beads. And this is a full-size quahog shell piece of wampum. That's the central piece. And these are not, as far as I'm aware at this moment, not made in any terms of criticism, but these are actually just incorporating the material that became enveloped into the culture of Native Americans at the time. But the notion of people being traded for these beads and the power in these beads is something that Dan Loudfoot does talk about in terms of being aware of the introduction of this material as a method of dispossession. So it allows us to have conversations. These are actually, all these pieces will be in the same case except the Callum and the Kim Hardy. And with these beads, they'll be very close to the trade beads that Alex showed earlier, but not in the same case. So they'll have an opportunity for conversation about the integration of glass into our local tribal nations works and what that might mean. And we're very careful not to tell the stories of our Tamaquag neighbors, but have them tell their stories themselves. So they are very much a part of writing the material for this show and also doing some programs around it. Next slide. Because we also have a 19th century village, next slide, which we do actually preserve skills of 19th century craftsmanship that would have been inherent in a maritime village of sort of the 1870s to 1890s, which is the same time period, which is quite interesting. We are also bringing in more of the sort of making of things, because there's no reason in the world why we don't have a glass shop in the village. We just don't have one. There are other things we don't have either, like a distillery that would have been there. But we want to talk about that sort of our dedication to preserving historic skill sets, including glass making and glass beadwork. So this is some material that's on loan from Jeffrey Pond down the street, and he'll be talking a bit about some of this material. Next slide. And then this is our lobby entrance. I just want to give you some context. So this is just in the same building as the exhibit, but this is what visitors first see when they come in the door. Next slide. In this space, what is a maritime museum to do without a gondola in a show about Venice? So one of the things I loved about Alex's show is there's a mention of Thomas Moran having a gondola that he brought to Long Island Sound, which is right next door to us. So that's actually the Mariners Museum in Virginia. This is a gondola that belongs to a company called La Gondola in Providence, Rhode Island. And all the gondoliers are trained. They all go to Venice. They all sing. They take it very seriously. And so this guy named Matthew Marcello is loaning us 2 gondolas, one for the opening weekend and one will be installed in the lobby. This is actually a gondola made by the Tramontine family in Venice in the 60s and carved by a very famous carver whose name I can't remember, but this was brought over to the United States decades later, and now it gives tours on the Providence River. But it's an absolutely exquisite gondola that will be in the lobby for people to see when they come in the door. And there'll be another one for opening weekend that will give tours of the river. And he's really hoping to sing under the mystic drawbridge. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think that might be the last slide. Is there another one, Camilla? Oh, and just in closing, I just want to mention, we're also probably soon getting the Coronet into our shipyard. So there are a lot of different connections we're making, which is a Gilded Age 131-foot wooden vessel that was owned by Rufus Bush, who was an oil tycoon in the 1880s, very much the kind of person who would be buying the glass in this exhibition. And so we're going to try to make some interesting ties with some of the decorative items from that boat as we're working on it over the next 4 years, but we'll do some programming around that during this exhibition. And then also, if you're not able to come to the show, please check our website, because we are going to have a very interesting and robust slate of programs that will deal with everything from gondola building to glass blowing. And some of the experts that have been mentioned in this program will be part of those conversations. And then if you can't do that, or you still want more, next fall in September 2023, we're doing a show of Blashka invertebrate glass models. By coincidence, I'd already had that planned. So we're doing sort of the year of glass for us. But those are made more in a flame work technique by a German father and son, and they're going to be on loan from the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. But it's another opportunity for us to talk about glass and to partner with Corning, who also has a large collection of that material. So, so with that, I will close, and thank you so much for your time. And I'll leave it to Camilla.
My goodness, thank you both so much. This has been the ultimate treat. I'm really sad that we have to sadly close this shortly, because really it has been completely enlightening, and what an amazing collection of images you've treated us to as well. So thank you both so much. We do have a few questions. We don't have much time, sadly, but Alex, I wondered whether I could just Well, first of all, congratulate you on this extraordinary achievement. I think you mentioned there were more than 40 institutions and collections involved in involved in the show. So congratulations on this achievement. But you said it was many years in the making. How did the idea for the exhibition come about originally?
The idea originally became because I was working before the Smithsonian at a museum called the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, which, much like the Corning Museum of Glass, has a working hot shop on its campus, and they have one of the largest collections of glass of any art museum in the United States. And through my own proximity to that glass collection, I started thinking more about the connections between glass and other branches of the arts, and then began to notice, particularly in the works of American artists who were traveling in Venice, some of these connections actually being visualized. So it was something that started with a couple of images like the Whistler print that I shared at the beginning of this, but also very much through being in direct conversation with glassmakers and from watching glass itself getting made. So it was a sort of wonderful coincidence of where I was working and my proximity to glass. And I'm just really hoping with this exhibition to create a wider awareness of that particular medium among scholars of paintings and vice versa, so that these kinds of ideas can be explored in other places and other time periods, and that multimedia shows that are doing crossover between fine and deck arts can continue.
Absolutely. Actually, maybe a question for Christina as well. Sometimes glass does have a tendency to be relegated to dusty vitrines in the back corridors of museums, and it suffers slightly from the younger sibling syndrome of versus art. It can sometimes be considered decorative or craft. And we actually had a couple of years ago a great talk involving various museum professionals, including Carol White from the Corning, and it was titled "Making Glass Matter in Museums." How big a role in your current exhibition will glass play in relation to paintings and works on paper? And I'd love to hear a bit more about the way you're planning to present glass in terms of the presentation and the programming in order to bring it to new audiences out of those dusty back corridors and into the spotlight. I'd love to.
So we have a really interesting design where the glass will be seen on two sides of freestanding walls. So we have the opportunity to interpret them in two different ways. So on one side, it might be closer to the maritime paintings and Venice and sort of Murano maps and things like that. On the other side, it's more about the making of the pieces. So we're trying to bring as much exposure to it as possible. To me, and I also was a professor at RISD, which is one of the biggest programs in glass blowing. So I have a big interest in it. So we're definitely going to make it quite prominent. And the paintings really shine, but as I said before, the stars to me is the glass, because it is so unexpected. I think people do tend to not see it as much when they come into it. It's all Sargent and Whistler, and I think when I went into the Smithsonian show, the glass was just, even though smaller than imagined, it draws you in. It requires you to spend time with it. That kind of level of skill and expertise is something that I think people just get completely blown away by. And so I think it will definitely be a big balance with the show that we're putting on.
And it's great that you're partnering with Corning as well. And you mentioned before that there will be opportunities for people to see glass being made and blown, which will be, it is completely magical. And you can actually understand why those artists, when they came to Murano back in the frame that your exhibition is talking about, were so enchanted by it, and why they felt compelled to try and capture it on canvas or on paper.
Yeah, we tried very hard to get the Corning Mobile Hot Shop to come during the show, but it's the dead of winter. So that might be something we do post-exhibition next summer.
Absolutely. And Alex, you mentioned that very sadly the exhibition had been due to come to Venice itself, but sadly due to COVID, it wasn't possible to come to the Capezzaro. Would you have adapted the exhibition in any way for a Venetian audience? How has the exhibition changed over its three-part journey, and would it have changed in any way for Venice?
I think the main difference at Venice was in our original discussions with the museums there to use glass from the Museo de Vetro's collection rather than the pieces that you'll be seeing at Mystic. All of the glass, or I should say almost all of the glass that you are seeing at Mystic is from American Museum collections. And these are not just pieces that are currently owned by American museums, but they're pieces that have been in those collections for 100 or more years. Because what was important for us was to show a picture not just of the types of glass that Americans were collecting, but actually the specific objects. So almost every piece of glass in the show has direct American provenance back to the Grand Tour era. These are actual pieces that we know particular collectors in the 1880s or the 19-teens purchased and brought back, and then later donated to museums. So the difference, if we had been using the Venetian pieces, would have been in respect to just the logistics of transport and the cost of that, using equivalent pieces of glass that would be only traveling maybe across the lagoon rather than across the Atlantic Ocean. But otherwise, we had conceived of the show as being relatively the same. However, I think that depending on parameters, this could have been an exhibition that encompassed also the taste for Venetian glass in this time period by artists and audiences in the UK, in Germany, and in other places, because Americans by no means, or certainly not, they were not the only ones who were enthusiastically collecting glass. So it is a story that could go on and have many, many other chapters. And even in putting together a strictly American story of this taste, there were many other objects, commissions, and collections that we could have included. And I think that's just in many ways an indication that there's a lot more research to be done on this, and probably a lot of glass hiding out in attics or basements of other museums that is still waiting for future exhibitions to put it in the spotlight.
Obviously, from our point of view, we're thrilled that you're putting glass in the spotlight, and hopefully it's going to light the way for other shows as well, as you say, to integrate more fine art with glass as well. And certainly from what we've heard, thank you both so much for the most tantalizing description of this exhibition. I am incredibly envious of your local visitors who have it on the doorstep, but I have no doubt that this talk will have really whet the appetite of many people who will now be thinking about possible ways of making it to Mystic when the show opens on the 15th of October, and I believe it closes in February 23. So there's a nice long time period. And as you said, in the meantime, you have a wonderful website and a beautiful catalogue, which is available. It will be available shortly, I believe, through the Mystic website and the bookshop. But in the meantime, yes, thank you both so much. And on behalf of the festival, I'd just like to thank everybody else for watching. I'm sure you've enjoyed it just as much as I have. It's been such a treat. So Alex and Christina, we really are very, very grateful to you. We're also very grateful to Apice for supporting this program. And I would just like to remind everybody that this is part of a series of conversations. We actually have another completely different conversation taking place tomorrow, which is called The Art of Handling Glass in Venice, Homo Faber and L'istanza del Vetro. Homo Faber is a temporary exhibition, an extraordinary showcase of fine, high craftsmanship, which takes place every 2 years on San Giorgio Maggiore, and L'istanza del Vetro, which is an absolutely exquisite space in Venice on the island of San Giorgio, which also showcases 2 exhibitions of glass every year. So that talk will be on Friday, tomorrow, the 23rd of September at 11 a.m. Venice time. And we will have Alberto Cavalli, who's the Executive Director of the Michelangelo Foundation for Creativity and Craftsmanship, as well as the General Director of the Fondazione Cologni dei Mestieri d'Arte, as well as Laura Corazzol, who's the Registrar for L'istanza del Vetro, and Alice Zanon, who is the Gallery Services Exhibition Manager at Apice. That's what we've got to look forward to tomorrow. But just once again, thank you so much to Alex and Christina for a real treat of an hour. And we much look forward to finding out more about the exhibition and hopefully to paying a visit in the months to come.
Great. Thanks for having us.